was just thinking back, as we're talking about that interplay, to the pushing boys forward. Robert Gould Shaw, who we mentioned earlier, the colonel of the 54th Massachusetts, one of the first colored regiments, didn't really want that command. But his parents were leading abolitionists. And when he wrote to tell his mother, he was a captain in a white regiment, that he would turn it down, she essentially wrote back, "How could you do that to me? How could you let me down?" And of course he goes to his death. And the Confederates, and I compare it in the book to what Achilles does to Hector at Troy, where he just abuses the body. The Confederates stripped him and buried him face down in Fort Wagner's ditch with his men, which they considered a huge insult. But his parents, even though I'm sure they were privately heartbroken, sort of put on this amazingly good front and say, "Well, that's the death Rob would have wanted. Parentheses, we shoved him into it."
Well, this leads to a question on atrocities then, since
Yes.
we're talking about this interplay, and there certainly were on both sides, and you alluded to them just a few moments ago, both soldier upon soldier and soldier upon civilian.
Absolutely.
And maybe civilian upon soldier.
Yes.
Certainly Fort Pillow and Fort Wagner are well known. Sherman's March is another one.
It is.
Just to take that one for the moment, I mean, what was the atrocity rate there? Was it as bad as it is portrayed afterwards?
That's a great question. It is a great question. And I think it was bad. I know there's a debate now. Some historians are beginning to say that Sherman used only proportional force, which is a phrase I might be uncomfortable with, because who defines proportional? But some saying that the cruelty has been overstated. But I think Sherman had a deliberate policy, and it applied to other commanders towards the end of the war, of trying to break the will of the people to fight by essentially forcing them into starvation, enormous deprivation, exposure. You know, again, it's easy for us when we think, well, he came through and they burned a 50-mile wide path, to say, okay, fine. But all those civilians are stripped of their food, their shelter, their warmth, and their water. Not always deliberately, but I liken the army to a city on the move, and it just drains everything, the water and so on. But Sherman, I think we can definitely say, did this deliberately, and I feel that he went over the top. That I'm one of those old-fashioned historians that thinks that his anger at the South had become almost manic. I don't want to contribute to the school that says he was, on akin with the Mad Hatter by late 1864. But I do think he was suffering war psychosis. He was so angry at the South and what it had done, and the personal price he'd paid, you know, early in the war, having what amounts to a mental breakdown because of the stress of command, and feeling that the South has dragged America into this horror, that I think his anger is not proportionate. He does things such as stabling his staff's horses in a church. So, you know, animals dropping 20 pounds of manure each in your local church isn't really a military tactic.
So is what Sherman is doing to break the will?
Yes.
A very modern war term.
It is.
Was he a proponent of that then, and he pushed that on?
He was indeed.
So this is, I mean, how proportionate is hard to say. You know,
No.
Pain is difficult to parse.
Yes.
Dresden,
Yes.
Sherman's March.
Yes. It is difficult. I think where I feel the question remains a very difficult one in terms of, you know, supporting Sherman going so very far. is that it's still not proven that this extreme harshness will necessarily break the will to fight. It
Well,
does.
you allude that it actually gets the fervor going again.
It can very much.
Hate back at you.
Exactly. Studies show that the British, for example, during the Blitz in 1940-41, have been sort of thinking, well, the Germans aren't that bad. They didn't know about the concentration camps yet, so what the heck, why don't we make peace with them? But when they start to bomb the cities, the British say, well, bugger you, we'll fight you to the end. Now, the Germans later, and the Japanese, we just are so intense that it may well have worked, and we did slow their production. But you can argue this has a boomerang effect, that Southerners might have been more willing to give in if it weren't that, they heard that what Sherman and Sheridan and Hunter did was so devastating that if they surrendered, they would be prey to something like the fall of Rome. Mm-hmm. And a very wonderful book, and I apologize again, I don't have the author's name right to hand, but a marvelous book on the salt supply failing in Georgia a year before Sherman invaded, and that this is what led to the great Georgia defection from the Confederacy. The boys come home because without the salt ration, you don't have salted meat through the winter. The boys have to come home, and the civilians just lose heart for the fight. So it remains a very open question. I just feel that towards the end of the war, not just the Union generals, but both sides have lost a sense of proportionality in what they're doing.
And of course, the atrocities, as you point out, were worse in the border states.
Oh yes, that
Kansas, positively.
Absolutely.
So this was really where your neighbor is going to kill you, versus
yes.
Sherman coming down and wiping you out.
It is exactly, and we know that wars don't end when generals put their swords on the table. That carried on; those feuds carried on for years after the wars in Kentucky, where I have worked. As you know, the feuds carried on well into the 1880s that were bred in the war.
Yeah. Glenn, here in Chicago, you could have come in, but we're happy to have you virtually as well. This is what we're about. Was there an analogy, or is there an analogy in Civil War battle to modern day drones?
Oh, gosh, that is a wonderful question.
Or maybe someone who went behind lines.
Yes, well, we certainly do have spies in the war. We have partisan rangers, but I would have to say I think it's more up close, whites of the eyes, fighting. It is a wonderful question. I would have to think about it. I know many of us do feel that drones have introduced much more of a new element into war, and I'm not sure that I can find a parallel. I'm going to ask you.
I can't think of one. I'm kind of trying to do that as well, and I can't think of something like that. Technology was changing.
Yeah.
The balloon is as close as one might get.
Yes.
To spying on you, at
yes.
least maybe can't throw a bomb over at you,
Right.
although maybe they tried that too.
Well, they did. I mean, we do have, yes, now you put us onto a very interesting line of thought. Hate to say this in the Abraham Lincoln bookshop. I feel a bolt of lightning will hit me. But
I'll step back.
But Lincoln did authorize the firebombing of Charleston, and this is indiscriminate. If we can draw a parallel, it is that a drone, despite our handouts, is not always accurate. We say we took out this jihadist, but in fact we may have hit the jihadist and 12 of his family at the same time. And similarly with something like the firebombing of Charleston, the Union Navy picked out landmarks in Charleston to aim at, and it was a civilian city. So we do have some of that going on, where we are indiscriminately projecting missiles. So yes, you put us on something good there.
Those of you out in Webland, I've just been told by our technical experts here that the Ask a Question link on the viewer is not working. So please, if you have any questions, submit it to staff@alincolnbookshop.com. Staff@alincolnbookshop.com if you have a question remaining while we're still live in the next 20 minutes or so.
See, we should have used carrier pigeon.
There, we should have done
the old ways are the
exactly.
better ones.
Since you brought them up, these sailors, what were the similarities and differences
Yes.
that the Army had on land and the sailor out in the battlefield?
Right.
Certainly was easier to clean up the battlefield
It
out
was.
on the ship than
Yes.
it was on the land.
Yes.
But what was the
Yes.
differences and similarities between the two,
That-
especially in wounds and how their medical care could have been?
Right. The naval personnel faced many of the same kinds of wounds, but largely a sailor would face heavier forms of munitions, shells, hot shot designed to burn the wooden ships, many of which were still the frontline fleet.
Certainly more concentrated.
More concentrated, very definitely. If any of you have seen that movie Master and Commander, based on O'Brien's work, there's a scene at the beginning where the French ship fires round shot and it just takes out all of the woodwork on the upper deck, and those shards, those flying shards, were a terrible threat, just as artillery shooting into treetops on land brought down shards. They faced fire from burning ships, but of course on land the soldiers wounded faced burning to death because the rounds set the brush on fire. So as you said, concentrated periods, not quite, I think, so often. I think a lot of naval life was tedious on station in the Union Navy, looking for blockade runners in the South, waiting for the Union to try to invade up a river and so on. The Confederates faced a terrible situation. I mean, they put cotton bales on river boats and called these gunboats, and they lasted minutes and they burned quickly. But I think something that sailors didn't face was the awful filth and the malnutrition in the field. You mentioned, that they could clean up. Okay, after an action, you will have body parts all around the ship. You will have blood running through the scuppers, but they get the pumps going and you can clean it all up. And as I say in the book, okay, we're talking about hundreds, probably. You have a lot of water to help you and to wash your instruments in, bathe wounds. What when you multiply that into tens of thousands and you don't have the water? And you've got to bury. I mean, burial at sea is quite convenient. And even in action, they wouldn't wait necessarily. They could stack the bodies and parts against the railing, but they might just throw it over. You can't do that on land. Gettysburg, Sharpsburg, you've got thousands of bodies lying around.
Did they bring the bodies to shore, or did they throw them off most of the time?
They all went into the water.
Yeah.
I think the idea we have today of everybody being returned simply didn't exist.
No. And land as well.
And land as well, exactly. The rich, which often equated with officers at a high level, could buy a coffin that was lined with charcoal, and the best were made of zinc so that they didn't smell and the charcoal absorbed the body fluids as you decayed. But most soldiers were buried in the field. And I think, and I try to put this out there in the book, that one of the most tragic features of the war for me is the inability of civilians to bring closure. The boys are gone, you don't know where. If you're lucky, someone in the unit will say, well, I saw him at 3 o'clock and he was wounded. He was lying, under a shrub trying to dress his wound. But so often they don't know what happened to their
They just
boys.
disappeared, and that's that.
They just disappear.
And on the rolls, they're not there. Well,
Exactly.
that's
They are atomized. One of the things that we often don't realize as civilians is that the human body, when in contact with flying metal, just disintegrates.